Infertility. Cold. Empty. Barren. Not having children. Not having grandchildren. Unsympathetic. Career obsessed. Anger. Anger. I started the research in childlessness because I have a direct experience of it. And a few years ago, my husband and I were diagnosed with unexplained infertility. And I bet you haven't heard about that either. Which means that our bodies are totally fine, our medical tests are totally fine, but somehow we don't get pregnant. So much for the infallibility of science. Medicine doesn't know why. I started research about childlessness because, as a scholar, I was curious. There is a growing amount of people without children, but we don't hear them. We don't see them. Why is there so much silence? That was a little experiment, because you see, I'm trying to find a different language. Because I've realized that I need to put more of my body and more emotion and feelings in what I communicate when I talk about this topic. Because childlessness is very much about the body, this body. And this body is part of my research. So how can I leave it out? And also, I've realized that I can talk for hours about my topic. I can give you my results, my findings, but I'm not sure you can understand what I'm talking about unless you feel a little bit of what I feel and a little bit of what my interviewees feel. So I'm into this exploration. And I'm going to develop it a bit more. I'm going to give a performance lecture at the Festivalen, which is going to take place here in Oslo. So unfortunately, I would like to invite all of you, and also our international guests, so I wish you were here. And I want to thank so much Camilla Tverbach, sitting there, and who is guiding me on this very exciting and also very new journey for me. So let's come back to my research. Okay, I've been quite busy, and I've done different things in relation to childlessness so far. I've done interviews with about 15 women, and I'm getting also more interviews that have been filmed by Hilde Haug in her documentary as well, so I have access to extra material. Thank you to you as well. So with men and women from Norway, Sweden, the UK, and Italy. I've also done an analysis of nearly 50 movies from Norway, Italy, and the US about how childless are represented in cinema. And I've also started writing an autoethnography. So this is a book about what it means to be childless and what it feels to be childless in a society that revolves around children and families. And I want to focus on the autoethnography aspect. But I also want to tell you briefly why I got there. And the reason is that I started doing interviews. I can't really go into all the results, so I'm going to give them to you in a nutshell. But through the interviews, I thought women would use communication technologies. That's what I'm mainly interested in because that's my field of study, to connect with each other about this topic. But it turns out I was completely wrong. Because, in fact, most childless women don't want to talk about it. This is not something you want to advertise about yourself, because there is a lot of shame attached to not having children. And at that point, I started wondering, where does this shame come from? So I thought I would investigate what's in the media. And again, I can't give you all the full results of this, of the analysis of the movies, but it was an extremely fascinating journey, also a very disturbing one. So I'll give you, in a nutshell, what I found. So despite the fact that these movies are from different countries, they cover different periods from the 1940s to today, they cover different genres, from drama to horror to comedy. The representations were pretty much the same across the board. And the childless characters tend to die at the end of the plot, either because they commit suicide or because they are being killed by other characters. So that's very interesting. If they don't die, it's because they become normal by, in fact, having a baby, either because they become miraculously pregnant or because they adopt, they acquire a baby in one way or another, sometimes even finding it in a rubbish bin. They tend to be weird in the best case, but most of the times they are completely crazy, psychopathic, they are killers. That's why they are killed by others, because that's the only way you can get rid of them. You can't stop them. They're like the Terminator in an evil way. And they are out to destroy other people's lives, because apparently they can't be happy, and so they don't want anybody else to be happy. The only exceptions are men. So childless men are totally fine. In fact, it's never an issue for them. And superheroes. So the only good reason for a woman not to have children, it doesn't matter how high-flying your job is, it will never compensate for not having children. The only thing that can compensate is if you're saving the world. So that's what having children and not having children competes with. If you don't have children, then at least you have to save the world. So watching all of these movies and coming to these conclusions was really quite disturbing. And it started raising a lot of questions. Because I thought, well, this portrayal is very damaging, if not demonizing. Well, no wonder nobody wants to advertise they are childless when this is what the world unconsciously thinks of the childless. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think there is a conspiracy against the childless. This is all unconscious. But then, how come that whenever you need a person who's available any time of the day, or you need a villain, then you always choose a childless person? So I was wondering, asking myself questions about the underlying messages in these movies. So what came across is that a life without children is not possible, it's not an option. So it's inconceivable. So what does this do to how we understand the standards of normality? Also, yeah, childless is always a problem that can be solved. So miracle babies are the norm. That's the same also in media coverage. And yeah, childlessness by circumstance doesn't exist. Either you choose to be childless or you are a desperate person, but nothing in between. So I started wondering what kind of effects might these representations have, because they seem harmless, and the characters are normally secondary characters, so it's something that you absorb, but you don't really pay attention to. So what kind of effect might this have? so I started thinking, does this affect the well-being of the involuntary childless? Because they never see themselves represented anywhere, and whenever they see themselves represented in such a negative way, does it affect the health, for example, even of men? Because they're supposed to be fine, when maybe they're not, and we will hear what you have to say about that. Does this affect life choices? I think so, because if I pay attention to myself and I wonder, why have I perhaps waited so long? It's because I thought it was easy, because all women get pregnant at first try in every movie. So I never really questioned it, because that's normal, right? Yeah, also young people nowadays, they tend to postpone, they tend to think, oh, I'll just freeze my eggs, I'll just use IVF, but there is no guarantee that this will work. In fact, the rate of success is very low. And does this affect policy? Yes, again, it might, because the idea is that to solve the problem, you need to provide a child. But yeah, what does this wanting to have the child at any cost lead to? Perhaps years of suffering. Are they really worth it? People damaging their health trying to get a baby. So these are all important questions. What I also started seeing is that all the stories I saw in the media or in movies, they were not my story. I started feeling resentment for not being represented. I was nowhere. And also having talked to so many people, I mean, neither their story was there. And I'm going to show you two examples. They come from the same newspaper, Aftenposten. This is the main newspaper in Norway. And sorry for selecting examples. There could be many I could have used, but they are the ones my body told me to use. Because they are the ones that really hurt, I mean, as a physical feeling in my body when I saw them. These are just tiny examples of this continuous dripping and dripping of messages that somehow denies also our existence. So one of them was the society without children versus the society with children. Note, some pick up children, others pick up sushi. Two parallel societies are growing apart in our country. Another one is, should she choose a life with or without children? And so this is a psychologist who answers questions. And I was really struck by this image where you have on the one hand the troubled mothers, and on the other hand the careless, childless. And again, even here, you know, because I don't have children, I go out, I pick up sushi, I have this fantastic life. And so, you know, I'm sure there are people like that, and by the way, this article was very reasonable. But it's this image, you know, there are many involuntary childless people who suffer. And this article was ironic, was supposed to be fun. Well, I didn't find it fun at all. And in fact, I even wondered, how can you make fun of this when there are so many people suffering? How is this normal to make fun of this topic? You wouldn't make fun of rape, you wouldn't make fun of mental illness. Why is it okay to make fun of childlessness? Okay, so this is the reason why I'm writing the autoethnography, because I really thought I need to explain to other people what it means and what it feels. So I need to reclaim childlessness. And in fact, I hated this term because I seem to be defined by what I don't have. What does it do to you, even that? But then I thought, well, and it's not surprising, because if nobody speaks out, then how are the others supposed to know? So if you don't speak for yourself, others will speak for you. But they are saying the wrong things. And so that's why these are just some examples of points I'm going to make. Well, that I'm making, I'm nearly finished. There is much more, of course. So I just want to say that it's not about not having the baby. Of course, that's a big part of it, a major part of it. But there is so much more beyond this that we need to talk about. And I would like to borrow the words of Jodie Day. She's a British activist who is the founder of Gateway Women. This is an association for women unite by and beyond childlessness. And she writes, what we and others and others often fail to realize is the depth and reach of our loss. Not only we never have children, but we will never create our own family. We will never watch them grow, never throw children's birthday parties, never take that first day school photo, never teach them to ride a bike. We'll never see them graduate, never see them possibly get married and have their own children. We'll never get a chance to heal the wounds of our own childhood by doing things differently with our children. We'll never be grandmothers, never give the gift of grandchildren to our parents. We'll never be the mother of our partner's children. We'll never stand shoulder to shoulder with our siblings and watch our children play together. We'll never be part of the community of mothers, never be considered the real woman. And when we die, there's no one to leave our stuff to. And no one to take our lifetime's learning into the next generation. If you take the time to think about it all in one go, which is more than most of us are ever likely to do because of the breathtaking amount of pain involved, it's a testament to our strength that we are still standing at all. You might think this is a lot, but actually there is more. I was mentioning already the problem of social isolation, which is hidden, but it's there. And I'm not going to repeat, I've made a point earlier. What about identity? So when being a woman is so strongly associated to being a mother, then what are you? I must say I feel more close to men than to mothers. I've even considered starting using the neutral pronoun for myself. If I have a question and it says to define your gender, if there is the option other, male, female, other, I choose other. That's examples of what it means to be childless. And this might be my story, but I'm sure this resonates with the experiences of other women. Also, you experience some devastating loss of meaning. So why should you get up in the morning if all my life is here? So after I die, I've become extremely aware of my own mortality. I don't leave any genes behind. So after I die, there's nothing left after me. I mean, it's like a death sentence, really. It feels like it. So sometimes you really wonder, why am I doing what am I doing? What is this for? I could tell you about religion, how I feel a bit alienated by the prayers of my own religion. I'm Catholic, that say, blessed be the fruit of thy womb. And I can't stand looking at the Virgin Mary with the baby in her arms. Sorry if this sounds offensive to some people, but I'm honest. Suddenly your body is not something you take for granted anymore. It's something that is boycotting you. So you start hating yourself, you start getting pains, you start disassociating. Somehow you feel like this is a burden you're carrying around. So it's very difficult. I mean, I'm taking really a long time to try and reconcile myself with my body. Yeah, I've talked about the mortality, but it's a feeling that somehow life might slip very easily away from you, and that I can die more easily than other people. I was mentioning health. I really believe all this communication around us. Every single time I see myself misrepresented, I can feel it. It's like a pressure here. And it's like a tiny tension right here. It's almost like I want to hit back. It's like the beginning of what wants to become a punch or something. Because you want to react, you want to say, it's not like that. But I really, I'm more and more interested in how this communication aspect becomes physical. And how this wrong stories, they become inscribed in our bodies, and they drip and drip and drip, and somehow they don't go anywhere, they stay inside. And I think this well, was making me ill, and maybe I'm healing, but I don't know. Also, I'm also talking about the challenges of researching invisibility. As I was mentioning earlier, how to research something that is invisible, when the standards of normality seem so obvious, that how do you challenge them? I've also realized why there is so little research about childlessness that is not of a medical nature. It's because you really need to be childless to understand this topic, and the research hurts. And I had to take breaks. Sometimes the material you deal with becomes too overwhelming. Sometimes you can't read the page because there are too many tears in your eyes. I've had to see a psychologist after I had done a series of interviews because I was being overwhelmed, and this was letting too many issues out. And the interesting thing is it's like a CO2 poisoning. You don't realize it. You think, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And then all of a sudden, you hit the wall. And that happens as part of the research process. But over time, and it keeps on coming back, but over time you become better at picking yourself up. So there are also positive sides. And there are also political aspects, and I need really to get to a close, and we can talk about this more. Of course, if we don't have enough citizens, we don't have enough people to pay taxes. But there are other aspects that need to be considered. What happens when a growing proportion of your citizens don't feel represented? What happens in society? Also, children are a bridge to the future. So many women I talk to, they say, if you don't have children, you feel like your imagined future has been stolen from you. Well, in my case, also my past has been stolen from me, because if my family doesn't continue beyond me, everything my ancestors did before me was completely useless. So I'm stuck in the present. And I'm wondering, when more and more people in our society just live in the present, what does it do to a national project? A nation has history, has vision for the futures. How do you survive only the present? Okay, so in conclusion, don't get me wrong, I don't think children are bad or families are bad. I mean, of course, they're great. But I think we are going maybe too far. So I think there is a fetishization of family and parenthood to the point that those who don't share this happy dream, they become excluded. So how can we become more inclusive societies where we value everyone beyond their biological contributions, where maybe we are appreciated as parents of a different kind? So I've only scratched the surface, and I'm really, really sorry for going over time. But there is really a lot we need to talk about that goes beyond not having the baby. So where do we start from? Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Marjolein De Boer, a Post-doctoral Fellow at the Institute of Health and Society at the University of Oslo. And she'll be talking today about silencing childless women in fertility reality TV.
Thank you. This is a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine to watch what is called trashy TV, and reality TV is part of that. I have much more guilty pleasures, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And this is specifically about a certain kind of genre of fertility or of reality TV, namely fertility reality TV. But before I go into that, I don't assume that you all know what reality TV is or that you have watched the reality TV show, so I'm first going to introduce a bit what that is. And over the past 2 decades, reality TV has increased immensely in popularity, and it became a fixture of television programming. So, for example, channels like TLC or MTV, who have a global network, they predominantly focus on reality TV. And as reality TV adheres to, it at least claims to portray reality. So the everyday lives of real people. And it does so by covering many topics. So you see the life of hoarders, to polygamist families, to survivalists waiting for doomsday, but also people who voluntarily are closed in to a space together for months and months in Big Brother. But it saves a special place for women's experiences of infertility and fertility treatment. And these are the shows that I am interested in. So these shows follow women into fertility treatment or portray those who have conceived because of fertility treatment. And these are 2 online shows, examples: A Conception Story, which does follow women into fertility treatment, and then A Baby Story, who follows women who have conceived because of fertility treatment. But there's more. For more spectacle, you have celebrities who talk and portray their infertility issues. In Juliana and Bill. And this was a side story. It was not intended to be in the program. But the rationale behind it was that the number of watchers rised as soon as it became clear that they had fertility issues. So they kind of adopted that storyline as one of the main storylines within the show. And then there's Keeping Up with the Kardashians, maybe that's more known, where one of the sisters, the Kardashian sisters, also has fertility issues, and one of her sisters offers to be her surrogate. That's one of the storylines. Then there is a show called The Little Couple, who follows a couple with dwarfism and who have, because of their dwarfism, have difficulties to conceive, and eventually they adopt 2 children. And then there is these kind of shows, which is I would say a specific genre where it's portrayed families who have multuplets because of fertility treatment. So the chances of getting multuplets because of fertility treatment are higher. And in the US, the regulations are quite different than here in Europe. So you can have multiple eggs or multiple embryos put into your body, and then the chances of them becoming multuplets are quite high. So you have Kate plus 8, who had a 6-tuplet and already had 2 children. And then you have a couple from the show called Rattled, who had quadruplets. And, well, they follow them into their family lives. So this is the genre that I've studied. And in this presentation, I'll ask the question how the women in fertility reality TV are represented. And specifically, I would like to focus on how childless women are represented in these shows after fertility treatment, after they have gone into fertility treatment. Because this is quite an interesting question, because fertility treatment, as was already mentioned, is not successful by definition, although we would like to believe it is. The success rates for example, IVF, in vitro fertilization, are between 40 and 11% per egg retrieval. So by implication, this means that after fertility treatment, women will remain childless. Or have to go into other ways of having children, which are also, and this is quite problematic, presented as alternatives. So how are these women represented? But first let me elaborate a bit on the importance of understanding their representations in shows, in reality TV shows. Because they have a specific design. It's not just like a fiction series. They have a significant impact on the ways in which people come to understand reality, or at least that's what I'm convinced it does. Because they are framed as entertainment, but more than that, they are framed as representing the real experiences of real people. So to underline this, TLC previously used the slogan "Life Unscripted." This is the real lives of real people. But of course, and you can see this coming, a large portion of these shows is actually explicitly formatted. So this slogan might be more appropriate. These shows are scripted so that the viewers witness the participants' struggles with complicated moral dilemmas. And in doing so, the shows not only present the audience with the opportunity to judge those who are being watched, but they also steer viewers towards a certain kind of judgment. So reality TV educates their viewers to either make better choices than those depicted on screen, which is very present in the Keeping Up with the Kardashians, because they are represented as a distorted family, or to see characters as role models in good decision making, which is very present, for example, in the shows with the multuplets. So these are like super moms, and you should keep them as characters in how you design your life. So then, if reality TV might have a big impact on the ways in which we come to understand infertility and fertility treatment, the question arises, of course, again, what actually happens in reality TV shows. So how are the women in these reality TV shows represented? Well, there is a struggle for motherhood, which is implicit in the focus of the fertility reality TV topic. And unsurprisingly, these shows generally follow women through fertility treatment and represent it as a struggle of motherhood, in a sense that they depict, for example, the medications that these women have to take and the burden of the treatment themselves. So these women explicitly show on camera which medications they take, how it affects themselves, their bodies, their relationships. But it also depicts the disappointment and despair, especially when a fertility treatment doesn't work. And they also depict the unexpected side effects of fertility treatment when women become pregnant with multuplets and the complications that such a pregnancy brings. And lastly, a bit less represented, but still, it's the struggles of couples, the hardship that couples have to go through in order to conceive. And Juliana, quite interestingly alone, on a television show, talked about the struggles between her and her husband because of the fertility treatment. That husband was nowhere to be found, but at least it was a topic to be discussed, which is not done often. So on fertility reality shows, such struggle narratives are generally stretched out over multiple episodes, and they sometimes even become like the main subject of the show, because apparently it attracts a lot of viewers, so for, well, commercial reasons. And the struggle often also functions as a cliffhanger to season finales. So will she not have a child? And then having a baby eventually is presented as the climax of overcoming couple struggles. So for example, in the case of Juliana and Bill on your right, they eventually, after multiple fertility treatments, go into surrogacy. So they, of course, this is a side note, these are very privileged, very white, very heterosexual people depicted. So it's a specific life on camera. And this couple had a surrogate mother who eventually gave birth to little Duke sitting there. So even the name gives a ring of that it's like the overcoming of all things. He's like the Duke, the king, coming to save us. And actually, it's actually narrated explicitly as such that Juliana said, like, it's all worth it. Now my life is fine. And again, no hardship follows. It's just like happy stuff. In the case of the little couple, it's a bit more dramatic. Also, after they adopt 2 children, but then the issue shifts from being a mother is really great, but then adoption brings new issues to the table. So then you have like these cultural issues that parents, explicitly presented as being parents, have to deal with. And also their creative ways of dealing with that, which is celebrated often. So this climax of having a baby always seems to be there, and they always become mothers, women. But now I've talked about mothers and not about non-mothers. So where are the people, where are the couples who do not succeed? Well, that's a bit of the issue, because they're really not there. There are all of the people that I've just talked about, almost all of them eventually end up with children, either through adoption, surrogacy, fertility treatment, name it. And there's only one exception, and this is Teresa and Jason from A Conception Story. And they, at least, are suggested to remain childless because we don't know, because they're cancelled from the show. And in one episode, it becomes clear that Teresa's treatment is unsuccessful and that there are no further options for treatment within at least traditional biomedicine. So meanwhile, she and Jason are still debating the option to adopt, but they seem to kind of go for the option not to adopt. And also not to have surrogacy, so they kind of juggle around with the idea, okay, we will remain childless. But after this episode, to my surprise, and without reasoning and really abruptly, the couple Teresa and Jason does not return on television. So they are not even featured in a follow-up episode a year after the season ended, in which all the other couples with their children are represented and tell their stories of what happened in the last year. So note that, although they're not explicitly represented, the presence of childless women after fertility is at least suggested in these kind of shows. They are featured in a sense that their storyline is depicted up to the point that a childless horizon is foreshadowed, after which their story is cancelled from the show. So what happens in this representation, or rather non-representation of childless women? So at first sight, there's an obvious play of norms at work in fertility reality TV. So it is never explicitly depicted childless. Childlessness is never explicitly depicted, and women are only followed into motherhood. So these shows affirm the normative promise of biomedicine to mold and shape women's bodies so that they can conceive. And in doing so, they underscore the continuing cultural and normative discourse that motherhood is essential to womanhood. But note, however, that the kind of portrayal of childless women on fertility reality TV is, figuratively speaking, a normative snake that bites its own tail. Because as reality TV still depends, at least to some degree, on the accidental unfolding of events, it seems that the possible outcome of remaining childless, despite such treatments, cannot be denied entirely. Consequently, childlessness is suggested and before the cancellation of a remaining childless storyline in these kind of shows. And it is such an abrupt and radical cancellation that this disruptive power echoes. So we kind of see and I know this is not the most fortunate picture, but that's also a thing. I Googled childless. This is what you get. So in the middle, women surrounded by strollers and, well, you don't see happy faces, but so that norm, the norm of biomedicine, is threatened, and this norm. So then, it is such a disruptive power that goes from these kind of representations that apparently it cannot be represented. And at this point, I would like to conclude my presentation with pointing out that such representations of childless women, or rather a lack of such representations, may have a significant and potentially harmful effect on the ways in which viewers come to assess and understand infertility. After all, reality TV is argued not only to have a constructive, but also to have an educational function in steering viewers' perceptions of the world. Then, when viewers are confronted with portrayals of infertile women and women who are at least thought of to remain childless after fertility treatment, and that women always become mothers, if viewers are confronted with portrayals of infertile women that always seem to become mothers, and those who are not worth watching apparently, viewers could then construct or adjust their lived reality and assessment thereof accordingly. So, for example, viewers may endorse perceptions that women's essential role in life is motherhood, that they are always able to conceive through technological assistance, and ultimately that remaining childless is not an acceptable option. And then what we get is these kind of advertisements of fertility reality TV show where the climax is already, it's a spoiler. They end up with children. So let's hope that in the future, and a bit more diverse than this, but that these might be the advertisements that we are looking at, that they do not necessarily become mothers. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Robin Paley, formerly a research consultant at the Open University in the UK and now an independent researcher on male childlessness. So we'll hear the other side of the story, right? Counselor, advisor to the board of the British organization Aging Without Children, and today he's going to talk about the real stories of men who wanted to be dads. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a joy to be here and an honour to talk about my research. This is me. This is a photograph taken in 1960, the year of my birth in Old Trafford, Manchester. Heavily industrialised city at that point, the biggest industrial estate in the UK. So very, very polluted, actually. And when I was born, I died, actually. But luckily, through the NHS, I had a midwife there, hooray, and she had some oxygen, and she revived me, to my benefit, possibly not to yours. Okay. Part of the output of that is I'm deaf by 30% in each ear. So English is a second language to me because I have to do a processing. And I come from Manchester, so English is a second language to me. So 4-0 down, only just kicked off, but bear with me. Okay, so that's me. I worked for 30 years as a scientific and technical photographer, and then a digital photographer came in and they didn't want me, so I trained as a counsellor. So that's where we're going on that. Okay. So in my training as a counsellor, I did my dissertation, and because it was counselling, it had to be something you experienced, and I was really broody. And by broody, I mean I really wanted to be a dad, deep down inside, not just in the head, but a feeling, yearning of wanting to be a dad. But I didn't become a dad, and so I investigated that, and that was my underlying question: was it only me? And no, it wasn't. Men do feel actually a biological urge and also a social urge. Plus is the life course. So that arc of life from birth to death, when we expect to achieve certain things at certain times, and that expectation is also put on us by society. by this time you'll be going to university, by this time you'll be doing this. And in all the men I've interviewed, the life course was leave school, do university, get a job, get a family. And that was it. Unless you were working class, in which case it was leave school, get a job, and do that. And then I did an MSc to try and look at the levels of yearning. I use the term broodness, but that doesn't translate very well. So yearning for parenthood, because the dynamic is women have a strong yearning and men aren't bothered. And that comes through in infertility research quite a lot, even now. And that's based on the fact they don't really get strong statistical backgrounds from men. Okay, so they blame the men rather than themselves. And then I found that it was around about the same level for men and women, but men reported being a little bit more depressed, isolated and excluded than the women, which was quite a surprise. And then I got a funded PhD looking at involuntary childless older men. So what was the impact of being childless as men? There's a paucity of research about men's lived experience in reproduction and in ageing. Men tended to work and die, but that demographic is changing. So lots of people are childless, typically seen as involuntary and voluntary, but actually includes a whole range of people across different periods of time in the life course, how they see themselves in relation to their fertility outcomes. So people who are estranged from their children, people whose children have died, can be classed as childless, although they may or may not class themselves as that. Most societies are pronatalists. They wouldn't really exist if children didn't keep coming through. But the childless are quite often labelled as other, they're stigmatised, and often feel treated as outsiders. And Cristina mentioned religion, and quite often barrenness is a term used there. And it's very strong in religion about Mother Earth and fertility, and men taking over and planting their seed. So, looking at men specifically, men who challenge traditional norms, gay men, house husbands, men as nurses, carers, primary school teachers are often subject to discrimination, exclusion, isolation and mistrust from everyone actually. So most of it research focuses on involuntary childlessness, and that's based on people accessing infertility treatment. And that term is often used in a clinical manner. Okay, so when I say I'm involuntary childless, if I'm in a clinical setting or a medical setting, they'll assume I'm infertile. Okay, but there's lots of reasons why I may not be a parent. But actual infertility treatment or potential has extreme effects on mental and physical health and identity and socially, economically for the person. For childless men, this sort of goes around the world, these stats, because there's not much research on men, so it goes on. So as I found out in my MSc, there were higher scores for anger, depression and isolation than similar women. It's really difficult to assess the level of involuntary childlessness because people who don't access treatment are not recorded. Okay, so a lot of stats around childlessness are based on infertility, involuntary childlessness. The real exception is Stats Norway. Big it up for Stats Norway, who do collect data on men, childless men and childhood men. And in the UK, it's not collected. They collect fertility history at the registration of birth, but it's the mother's fertility history, not the father's. So quite often, and that's standard more or less throughout the world, is you don't actually know the level of childlessness for men. So in Finland, a couple of years ago, they did a study of 35-year-olds. I think it was something like 26% of 35-year-old women were childless, 40% of men, 35-year-olds, were childless. Okay. And that has implications across the life course because societies overall expect families to care for you when you're older. You may not want that to happen, but it's embedded, and it's embedded within policy. I've now looked at policy documents in the UK. You just do a quick word count, look for childless and you won't find it. Look for family, you'll find it. Okay, so they're excluded at a policy level. And that's important because a lot of policy is dictated by numbers. So what bangs I'm going to get from my book, but if you're not actually in the policy, you're excluded. And what we find is that older child is not a disadvantage when the health is good, but when it fails, the family aren't there to mediate between formal care and informal care. But what we do know from stats, mainly, the older children have increased loneliness, social isolation, depression, and ill health. And in the UK, and I think most through Western countries, looking at demographics, that's a very big issue now, loneliness in later life, and what that means for health, and for governments, what that means to cost. And what we find from European studies, formerly married childless men showed poorer physical, mental health, risky behaviours, all that sort of thing, really quite bad for you. And a Swedish study found childless men and non-contact fathers higher death rate through suicide and risky health and social behaviours than comparable fathers. So it could be that becoming a father puts a brake on behaviour, physically, economically, and all those sort of things, but it also may give you another narrative to occupy that not becoming a father does. So there's maybe more social narratives around there for you to mediate your behaviour. So these are the men I talked to. So there's lots of different pathways to childlessness: economics, the social clock, the biological clock, partner choice, and relationship dynamics. And these change. The social clock, a Canold in Australia, in her study of women around about in their 30s, found the social clock was as important as the biological clock. What my peers are doing, what my family want me to do, all those sociological things. And the same for men, because quite often it's said men are fertile from puberty till death. But actually it's a slow decline. But it's, biologically, but socially as well, is it really acceptable to be an older father? There may be outliers like Rod Stewart and Elton John who can buy their way into acceptability, but if it's somebody just working locally, is it going to be acceptable? So I'm going to focus on John because he's got a really interesting timeline there. He and his partner met when they were 24. They had an agreement, but they had a talk about becoming parents. How many kids do you want? She said. 2 would be nice. What about 4? Well, I was shocked. But not in a bad way. I thought, wow, I didn't expect that. Life couldn't get any better. So they bought a 4-bedroomed house. And then the interest rates went up and they couldn't afford to have children. They delayed their fertility decision. Come to age 35, he says, the biological clock's ticking. That economic problem's gone. Let's go for kids. And she says, I never thought you were responsible enough to have children, which I guess is the time I started drinking seriously. And John, at age 59, had been in emergency admission 18 times in 10 years to a hospital. He had heart problems, diabetes, a lot of illnesses related to alcohol abuse. He also had suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts and plans. Okay. And so this is from the other men. Okay. I fell out of phase with normality or the expectations of how life is. There was an awkwardness, like people implying there was something wrong with you. You know, I'd look at my son growing up and remember me relating to my dad. So that generational continuity goes on. I felt the pain of it. Emotionally, there was a real gut feeling that, you know, I'm not the father of my own children. Ben, who said, I'd rather be a father than be married, that was more important to me. Usually the men said the important thing was to have a relationship and a child was the cherry on the cake, was the next step on the line of that. People just have no conception of how isolated someone who hasn't got kids in middle age is. And for Harry, whose partner had died 2 years earlier, that death had fractured his relationship with her family. And he was basically by himself. Loads of activities around here from people we know. I've dropped out of it because I hate going on my own. A problem, I'll solve it. I'm the only one. I don't know anyone. He'd lived there 30 years. Also, he didn't want to be viewed as a paedophile. So, the local kids used to come and play with their dogs, and his wife, his partner, was the gatekeeper to that. Once she died, he wouldn't let them in. I don't want to be seen as one of those men. And that's an underlying thing from my research, that all the men had a fear of being seen a paedophile. And you sort of have from lots of experiences. It's notable that friends who have children drift away, and children are a social bridge to formal and informal relationships. And there were advantages. You don't have to worry, you don't have to plan. They didn't seem to think that there was that much financial gain from it. And actually, if I'd had the opportunity, I would have rather been a parent. So for the older people, who's going to take us to hospital? Who's going to push us? When we fall on the floor, who's going to pick us up? Michael, his friend, his daughter had come to visit her dad and said, oh, you don't look too well. And she was a nurse, so let's get you to the hospital. 3 days later, he's having bypass surgery. Who's going to do that for me? You're suddenly aware you're no longer invincible, the aging thing. I don't want people saying, no, he's a bit of a paedophile, this one, looking at the kids. I think having kids is a way of producing a sense of continuity. Otherwise, death feels very final. If you're leaving kids, you've left something of yourself. And again, for David, actually, there's a legacy items. My mum was a painter. Who am I going to give these paintings to? What happens about those stories from the family? Do they end with me? So it's the end of a genetic line, but so much more as well. And for Frank, how is a man supposed to be a man? How is a man supposed to be a man if you're living in a little town, you're unemployed, you've got a bad back because you used to do physical labour, your ex-partner is coming back at you because the property prices have gone up, so there's more capital in the property, and you're under threat. How do I be a man? Where's my social script for that? I'm going to go for Martin. Martin was a working class man, a singleton. He was the only child. His parents were unskilled workers. He got married to a local girl, expecting to become a dad. They got divorced in his late 30s. At that time, she said, I was always scared of giving birth. And that was another underlying theme that came out, tocophobia, that partner's fear of childbirth. He got married again, and they tried for a child. It didn't work, so they tried IVF, and that's when he found out he was infertile and probably had been since he was 16. Okay? And they tried donor conception because she has the right to be a mother. Now, I did 2 interviews. On the second interview, he'd shown his partner the transcript of the first, and we sat around having a cup of tea and a biscuit before it started, and they both laughed and said, yes, if only we'd talked at that time, because I was only doing it for him. It's so deep and so personal that even in an intimate relationship, we suspend ourselves from actually why are we doing things. And so his partner's family, one of her nieces became pregnant, didn't have a father, and so he said, I want to be a grandfather. Can I be a grandfather? So they negotiated that, and he was a grandfather. So baby's born. 2 hours later, they get the call, he goes to the hospital. At that time, I pick up this baby, I have an idea of the deep connection between a parent and a baby that I never really appreciated before. I wanted to be a dad, but that emotional connection was something I had no concept of, and I do now. And for him, that gives an existential thing for the future. If I've got another 15 years, that sees my granddaughter to 18. You can see them to be an adult then. So Aging Without Children is probably the first organisation in the world to deal actually with people. It's a grassroots organisation that we're trying to raise the profile of people aging without children. In the UK at the moment, there's probably 1 million people aged 65 and over who are aging without children. In 2030, there'll be at least 2 million people aging without children at age 65. And that has massive implications for pensions and for social and health care. And that's why we're trying to get this into the policy, and policy is important. Okay, what's going to happen here? So from the AWOC point of view, here we go. How did academia and policymakers miss this? This big population, how did it happen? Adults should provide and facilitate care for older people, yet total silence around the impact of it. Why is there so much personal anger and institutional defensiveness, denial and resistance to the above? Okay, and there's the stats. Okay. So, for the UK, at least 24% of men are childless. Childless men are less wealthy, less happy than fathers. This has been indicated by research. Childlessness and infertility are excluded from masculinity literature. It's feminisms and feminist scholars who've really raised the silence of men's voices when it comes to reproduction. And older men are more likely to be placed in formal care than equivalent women. Okay, and this is my poem, I'm afraid. I should have warned you. But this is something I wrote at the end of my MA about me and the men. There's something missing. A conversation ended before it began. Scatterings of coulda, shoulda, woulda, dada. The latent maelstrom of the non-man. There's something missing, holding a life-wide gap. Breathing wallpaper, I am whole and incomplete. There's something missing. First to be left behind, first to be sent in. This line is not complete. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for it. It was really interesting. And I noticed that you had a very, very short line saying something about childless men and non-contact.
Fathers.
Fathers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think they are sort of a part of this story as well. Really growing. I meet a lot of fathers who involuntarily have no contact with their children due to conflict, high conflict, or sabotage. You know, the sabotage, what do we call that again? Yeah. And I often wonder what the health situation, I mean, if somebody, I don't know, I haven't seen any studies of that group alone, but I really think they consider themselves as childless, but in a very shameful way, because when they don't have contact, it implies certain, you know, bad things about them, which might not be true at all. And so I just thought that was it added to the complexity of the picture. And if I can make one more comment, because listening to you, I think it's the greatest therapy session I've had in 20 years. Really, I don't know if I'd be able to say this without tearing up, because this is very, very personal. And I think just what you said about it's so embodied. And I've seen counselors, I went to therapists, and the first psychologist I went to see, she said, so I can hear this is taking up a lot of time in your mind. Have you thought about doing something really fun? You know, could you just find some activity or something that would be really fun for you? And I'm like, so that's what your kids are to you? A fun game? You know, that I never said that I was bored. You know, I'm not in therapy because I'm bored. I'm in therapy because something is extremely painful. I think what you said about, to a certain point, I think you have to live it to know it. And I have never heard anybody mirror my life the way you just did. Thank you. This means so much to me, really. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just pick up on something you just said in relation to this issue of failing as a father, actually, because I just had a friend who had a baby with a woman, and they separated like 6 months later, and they went to this family counseling, and he said that should not be called family counseling, it should be mother counseling.
Yeah.
Because he felt like he was not heard, he had to struggle so hard to get time with his child, basically, and how much power the voice of the mother had in that situation. Yeah, just a comment.
Anybody else? Yeah.
I sit here thinking about maybe we raise children in the wrong way, as to prepare them for life, real life. It's going to be tough, it's going to be ugly at parts. You can't always get what you want. And how can you live life in different ways? And that's okay. I think that's one of the big challenges, isn't it? Both for school system and parents as such. And I think we're in sort of deep shit for the time being. Because I see, I have a daughter at the age of 23, and I see her, or the young people at her age, they sort of are told that you can do everything. You can have everything you want, everything is available, you can fix it. But of course that's not going to happen for each and every one of them. So both you have this enormous pressure that you can do everything, and you're not at all prepared that maybe you're not able to produce a child, at least not at the time of life when you think that everything else is sorted out. You have your education, you have your lovely partner, you have everything in place, and then you can start, and then maybe it's simply not going to happen. So I think that's more on the personal level, and then of course it's the demographics altogether that you showed up. What's going to happen to a society? And of course Norway is in a way, and many countries are, as you said, family is a way to sort of get plugged in. I became a mother at the age of 37, and before that I had always defined myself as by my work, my interests, what I was doing. And it was so strange to all of a sudden be the mother of my daughter in social contexts. And I said, oh, but that's not me. I'm very new at this role. How do I play that part of my life? So yeah, we have a lot to deal with. Both, of course, taking in all the sorrow and the feelings and pain. And I really think this has been a very thought-provoking day today so far. I'm here and I'm going to talk later from the perspective of the biotechnology board in Norway, and that's sort of like a very technical part of it. And I agree totally that all the emotions, also all the anger and frustration should be addressed in a way, because we need to deal with it as a society in one way or the other. Because at one time I felt very privileged. I ended up being a single mom because the dad decided otherwise. That is, he has always been a part of my daughter's life, but not my life, the way I expected it to be. And then I still felt very privileged. It was possible. I could combine being a mother, being a single parent. I had full opportunities of fulfilling my life, even without a partner in this society. So I felt, in a way, very privileged. And I think Norway is a very good society to live in. Different family situations and stuff. But still there is this, yes, there are many things to address, I think. Feelings as well as how do we get more robust children in a way. How can we deal with life being tough, not giving us what we want and what we strive for? Yes, that was what I would like to say now.
Can I just show a quick slide, and I'll try and get it. I was saying to Robert before about structural invisibility, and there's something about here. Heifer in the UK is the human Fertility and Embryology Authority. It's the regulator of the fertility clinics. And I went through their document looking for men, male and man, and compared it. Now, fertility is 50-50, and yet the fertility authority doesn't really seem to see men in that, and that's something. And while you were saying about invisibility, it's also what light is spotlighted you. So this sort of spotlights maybe a problematic thing with women, or just defining them by that and not defining them out. I know I'm going a bit mad on that because I'm not quite sure, because I've just thought of it, but there's something around that probably needs looking at or appreciating. No, you're in the shadows, but when you're not, what light is being shone on you?
Yeah, Hallie.
Related to what's seen and accepted in society, in your talk, you talked about postnatal depression, and it made me curious, when did that emerge in society, and how did that come to be a thing that people expect or are aware of, or don't judge in the same way they might judge other things? I wonder if that case might show a little bit of other ways that perceptions could be broadened, because presumably at one point that wasn't a thing, and now it is.
I'm not sure that I understood what you.
Well, as with most medical conditions, they've emerged at a point in time and in a social context. And I'm curious, I have no idea where and when and how that emerged as a diagnosis and as a social conception.
Okay, I don't. No, thank you. I don't have an answer when, and it's really important to see when and why. But I can say that once there is a clinical prescription or definition, it's really interesting to see that everything is going under it from now on. Because even regretting mothers, I'm always being asked, maybe they have postpartum depression, and like we have the title now, so everything is going under it. It's like all-consuming, because we have this clinical title. But these mothers are not, don't have postpartum depression. Some of them are already at their 60s or 70s. We can't relate to it anymore as like a depression after giving birth. 70 years later, they might be depressed of feeling regret, but it's not the same. And I don't know when, but it's really, it's a good question.
But it means we're also creating new social categories, right? So this regretting motherhood that didn't, or maybe it did exist, people just didn't talk about it because it was socially unacceptable and politically. Now that it's emerging, more people are talking about it. There's a hashtag, right? You must know about this. Regretting. You started? Okay.
I didn't start it, but because of my study, it was
started. Yeah. But already even in 2008, there was some French woman. She's, I think, a psychologist, and she wrote like 40 reasons not to have children, but yet has 2 children herself. But she talks about how having children is basically a way, to kind of feed capitalist societies, and it comes back to the whole political conversation that we've touched upon. But I think we have to talk about these feelings and these circumstances, and maybe they're not new from a historical perspective, but it's new that we're actually talking about them and facing them and being okay with regretting motherhood in certain societies. I think in other places it might not be so socially acceptable. I don't know if it's acceptable in Israel or...
No.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. It's unacceptable not being a mother. This is the first stage. It's unacceptable not being a mother in Israel.
But all of this will change. I mean, with the statistics that you're showing about the increased number of childless men and what we know now of childless women, I mean, there's going to be the future is changing in terms of these statistics. So now maybe it's not so much the norm, but maybe one day it will become. I don't know. I mean.
But then, what also Jodie Day, this activist from the UK, is pointing out is that we are the first generation who is experiencing this.
Yeah.
So we are basically the living guinea pigs. So there will be a policy in the future, but there's not a policy for us. So what's going to happen to us, basically?
Yeah.
So we are going through this huge social and political experiment. And so the sooner we try to do something about it, the sooner we don't fall through the cracks, basically.
I thought when I heard you, you said you truly wanted to be a father, and I felt in my ears that I'm hearing a sentence that I'm not used to hearing. Because most of the time we are talking about the yearning of women, and we are not hearing enough about men who truly want to be a father. I have a friend who became a father, and because of my study I made this distinction, and I asked him, did you want to be a father, or did you give your consent? Because in my study I'm doing I'm talking about wanting to and consenting to. And he said to me, of course I gave my consent. All my friends around me, friends around me, gave their consent. They didn't really want to be fathers. Right. And it was really interesting, they became fathers because of the partner wanted to.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting to feel in my body that I'm hearing a sentence that I'm not used to hear. And maybe we're not talking enough about men and their relationship to reproduction and fatherhood.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting about what social narratives are there for men to occupy, and that masculinity ideal is all about virility outside the body. Virile provider, and it's really interesting if you link that to sperm. Sperm is the only cell that can survive for any time outside the body. So there's almost a parallel sort of social bio process going on there if you want to do that. Yeah, it's very interesting. Sorry, I've got sidetracked onto social bio things.
I think because also if we will hear more about the narratives of men regarding reproduction and fatherhood, maybe it will will lift a bit of the weight from women, because we are the only one who is socially and culturally who are carrying it. The yearning, the biological yearning, and we want it, and we don't have anyone to share it with, because we don't hear enough about. Maybe it's just a thought that it's too heavy.
And I wanted to add to this because the women being the main carriers of this. So I think another thing we need to question is the fact that there is a lot of pain associated to not having the child, or maybe regretting the motherhood. But then there is a lot of pain related to undergoing the fertility treatments, so the treatment to become a mother, and so what Marjolein was also talking about. So it seems to be normal that as a woman, because you have this urge to become a mother, you are willing to subject yourself to anything, to endure anything to have a child. But then, I mean, why don't we question this? I mean, I remember this title, this headline about a Danish study that was saying, oh, after 5 years, 70% of the women undergoing fertility treatment, they get a baby. So, triumphal headline. Yeah, but this also means 30% after 5 years do not get a baby. So, 5 years of fertility treatment. If you haven't gone through fertility treatment, you don't know what this means. But it's like 5 years to me, it's the same length of World War II, and that is what I'm associated to. So it's like having done World War II and you don't get a result at the end. And how is it? So I think women need to be more aware of this possibility, because, and also it's not normal. So it would be fine to say, I don't want to subject myself to this. Because you might get the child or you might not. And your relationship might also fall apart because that's also what happens. And so do you really want to take this bet that can so much affect your life? You might end up without a partner and without a child after having suffered so much. So it seems completely fine that you should go for it, but why? Is that normal? It's not normal.
Let's have your one last comment before we break for lunch. You had your hand up before. I don't know if you still wanted to say something.
I forgot it. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So sandwiches are out here. We can bring them in. Thank you all to the people that spoke in this panel.